There is a particular kind of arrogance that comes with hindsight. We look back at the people of the past and shake our heads, smugly confident that we, with our science and our smartphones, would never have believed such nonsense. But the early colonists of America were not stupid people. They were, by the standards of their day, educated, devout, and deeply serious about understanding the world around them. The problem was, the world they had arrived in was terrifying, unfamiliar, and absolutely relentless in its capacity to kill them. And when human beings are frightened and confused, they reach for explanations. Sometimes those explanations were spectacularly, fascinatingly wrong. Welcome to a deep dive into the strange, the startling, and the occasionally stomach-turning world of early American colonial belief. From demons lurking in the forest to the curative power of urine, from murderous witches to the healing properties of executed criminals, this is the story of what the first generations of English settlers in North America actually believed. And just remember, this is not a story about foolish people. It is a story about human beings doing exactly what human beings do when they find themselves somewhere new and frightening, making it up as they go along. The devil owns the forest. Before we can understand anything else about early colonial belief, we need to understand one fundamental thing. The forest terrified them. Not in the way that a dark street at night might unsettle a modern city dweller, but in a deep, theological, bone-level terror that shaped every aspect of their spiritual and intellectual lives. The Puritan settlers who arrived in New England in the early 17th century brought with them a very specific vision of the world. God was everywhere, certainly, but so was the devil. And the devil, they were quite certain, had made his home in the American wilderness. The vast, dark, ancient forests that pressed in on every settlement from every direction were not simply trees and undergrowth. They were the domain of Satan himself. This belief had real consequences. The English settlers looked at the indigenous peoples who had lived in these forests for thousands of years and drew a conclusion. That was as logical to them as it was catastrophic for everyone involved. The Native Americans must be in league with the devil. How else could they live so comfortably in his territory? The idea was not fringe or whispered. It was mainstream Puritan theology. Cotton Mather, one of the most prominent ministers in colonial New England, and a man of genuine if misguided brilliance, wrote extensively about what he called the devil's territories in America. He described Native American religious practices as devil worship quite straightforwardly and without apology. He was not considered a crank for doing so. He was considered learned. This belief shaped the entire way in which colonists understood their relationship with the land they were settling. Clearing the forest was not just practical. It was a spiritual act of warfare against Satan. Every tree felled was a victory over darkness. Every farm carved out of the wilderness was a little outpost of God in enemy territory. The settlers understood themselves to be soldiers in a cosmic battle, and the geography of the New World was its battlefield. The consequences of this belief for relations between colonists and Native Americans cannot be overstated. If you genuinely believe that the people living next to you are servants of the devil, you are not going to treat them as neighbors. You are going to treat them as enemies of God, which is, in practical terms, considerably worse. The theology of the wilderness did not cause all of the violence of the colonial period, but it provided a framework that made that violence feel righteous, even necessary. It is one of the more grimly instructive examples of how a sincerely held religious belief can become a mechanism for atrocity. Spectral evidence and the courts of Salem in 1692, the town of Salem, Massachusetts, tore itself apart over witchcraft. This is a story that most people know in outline. The accusations, the trials, the executions, the eventual recantation and regret. What is less well understood is the specific, detailed, and genuinely believed theory of witchcraft that made the whole catastrophe possible. Central to the Salem Witch Trials was the concept of spectral evidence. This was the idea that a witch could send out her spirit, her specter, to torment her victims, and that the victims could therefore testify in court about what the witch's spirit had done to them, even if the witch herself had been nowhere near them at the time. In modern terms, this would be equivalent to convicting someone of assault because a witness claimed to have seen their ghost committing the crime. But in 1692 Salem, spectral evidence was considered not just admissible but compelling. The theory rested on a particular understanding of how witchcraft actually worked. The colonists believed that witches entered into a literal contract with the devil, signing their names in his book in exchange for supernatural powers. Part of the deal, as the theologians explained it, was that the devil gained a measure of control over the witch's physical form and spiritual essence. He could therefore dispatch the witch's specter to do his bidding, tormenting the faithful and spreading misery wherever possible. What made this belief so dangerous in a courtroom setting was that it was essentially unfalsifiable. If you were accused of witchcraft and the afflicted girls claimed your specter had been pinching them in the night, there was nothing you could do to disprove it. You could not prove you had been asleep in your bed, because your specter could be active while your body rested. You could not produce witnesses because your specter was by definition invisible to all except its victims. You could not point to your good reputation, because the devil had been known to impersonate the innocent to confuse the righteous. Some of the more thoughtful Puritan ministers, including Increase Mather, the father of the more famous Cotton, actually expressed reservations about spectral evidence during the trials themselves. He worried, correctly, that the devil might be capable of assuming the shape of an innocent person, which would mean the spectral evidence proved nothing at all. But his caution came too late to save the 19 people who were hanged, and the one man who was pressed to death with heavy stones, before the trials finally collapsed in on themselves. The aftermath of Salem was, in its own way, remarkable. Several of the judges and jurors who had participated in the trials publicly apologized within a few years. One of the afflicted girls, Anne Putnam, made a public confession in 1706, admitting that she had been deceived by the devil in accusing innocent people. The colony of Massachusetts eventually issued a formal apology and paid reparations to the families of the executed. This does not make the Salem trials any less terrible, but it does suggest that the capacity for self-reflection was present even in a society that had done something genuinely monstrous. The beliefs were bizarre, but the eventual reckoning with them was, in its limited way, admirable. The body as battlefield, disease humors, and the wrath of God when a colonial American fell ill. They faced a medical system that was, by modern standards, almost entirely useless, and in many cases, actively harmful. But it was not random or thoughtless. It was built on a coherent, internally consistent theory of the body and disease that had been inherited from ancient Greece, filtered through medieval Europe, and arrived in the New World largely intact. The theory was that of the four humors. The human body, according to this understanding, contained four fundamental fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Health was a matter of keeping these four substances in proper balance. Illness occurred when one of them became too dominant or too deficient. The job of the physician was to restore equilibrium, and the primary methods available for doing so were bleeding, purging, and vomiting. Bleeding, or phlebotomy, was the most common medical intervention in the colonial period. If you were feverish, you were probably too full of blood, so a physician or barber surgeon would open a vein in your arm or elsewhere and remove a quantity. The amount to be removed was a matter of learned debate. Too little, and the imbalance persisted. Too much, and you died, which happened with distressing regularity, and which was generally attributed to the underlying illness rather than to the treatment. George Washington, who died in 1799 and therefore falls just outside the colonial period, but was absolutely a product of it, is thought by many historians to have been killed by his doctors, rather than by the throat infection that prompted them to remove approximately 4 pints of his blood in a single day. Purging was no more pleasant. A variety of substances were administered to colonial patients with the goal of emptying the bowels or inducing vomiting, both of which were held to expel toxic excess humors from the body. Mercury compounds were popular for this purpose, and their continued use well into the 19th century left a legacy of heavy metal poisoning across the population that we are only beginning to fully understand through the analysis of historical skeletons. But the humoral theory was only half of the colonial medical picture. Layered on top of it was a thoroughly theological understanding of illness as divine punishment or testing. If you fell sick, it was worth asking what you had done to deserve it. Persistent illness suggested either ongoing sin or that God had a particular lesson he wished you to learn. This was not a metaphorical belief. People genuinely interrogated their consciences when they were unwell, looking for the spiritual cause of their physical affliction. The combination of ineffective medicine and theological guilt was a particularly miserable one. Not only were you ill, you were being bled and purged and forced to examine your moral record to identify where you had gone wrong. The wonder is not that so many colonial Americans died young, but that any of them survived at all. The remarkably widespread belief in witches, the Salem Witch Trials, are famous, but they were not the only occasion on which colonial Americans took witchcraft seriously. Accusations, trials, and executions for witchcraft occurred throughout the colonial period in multiple settlements and were rooted in a belief system that was far broader and more detailed than a modern reader might expect. The witches of colonial American belief were not merely people who practiced magic. They were individuals who had made a deliberate, conscious, fully informed choice to abandon God and serve the devil. This distinction mattered enormously. Natural magic, the kind that involved herbs and charms and the reading of signs, occupied a complicated middle ground in colonial thought. Some of it was tolerated. Some of it was condemned. But the witch, the real witch as understood by Puritan theology, was a traitor to God, a person who had looked at the available options and freely chosen the wrong one. This made her, in the colonial imagination, not merely dangerous, but actively evil in a way that commanded genuine moral outrage. The physical evidence of witchcraft that colonists looked for was extensive and often bizarre by modern standards. A witch's mark, a spot on the body that was insensitive to pain and did not bleed when pricked, was considered definitive evidence. Accused witches were subjected to systematic physical examinations by panels of matrons looking for such marks. Supernumerary nipples, skin tags, and simple moles were all potentially incriminating. The logic was that the devil sucked at these marks to seal and maintain his compact with the witch, so their presence indicated a diabolic relationship. Floating was another test. The theory, such as it was, held that water, being the element used in baptism, would reject a witch. An accused witch who was thrown into a body of water and floated was therefore proved guilty. One who sank might drown, but was at least presumed innocent. The circularity of this test was pointed out even at the time by some commentators, who noted that the practical outcome was bad either way, but the test continued to be used. What is fascinating about colonial witchcraft belief is how thoroughly it was embedded in everyday life. People did not simply worry about witchcraft during crises. They worried about it constantly. If your cow stopped giving milk, a witch might have cursed it. If your butter would not churn, a witch had interfered with it. If your child sickened for no apparent reason, witchcraft was a serious diagnostic possibility. Counter-magic protective charms and rituals, intended to deflect witchcraft, were a normal and unremarkable part of colonial domestic life in a way that the historical record only partially captures, because people did not always write down the things they took completely for granted. Providential thinking. God has hand in everything. One of the most pervasive and peculiar features of early colonial belief was the practice known as providential thinking, which was the habit of interpreting every event, no matter how trivial or how catastrophic, as a direct communication from God about the spiritual state of the community. A good harvest meant God was pleased. A bad harvest meant the community had sinned and needed to repent. A military victory confirmed divine favor. A defeat was a divine rebuke. A house fire was a message. A difficult childbirth was a warning. A comet in the sky was a portent of something, probably terrible. The art and discipline of reading Providence correctly, of correctly identifying what God was trying to communicate through the events of daily life, was considered a serious intellectual and spiritual undertaking, not a superstitious indulgence. Ministers kept careful records of providential events. Collections of remarkable providences were published, read widely, and treated as evidence of God's active engagement with the colonial project. Cotton Mather's Magnalia Christi Americana, published in 1702, is in part a sustained exercise in providentialism, reading the entire History of New England as a series of divine messages about the relationship between God and his chosen people in the wilderness. The problem with providential thinking, as even some contemporaries recognized, was that it was entirely too flexible. Any event could be read as divine communication, and the reading depended almost entirely on the theological prejudices and political interests of the reader. If a minister believed that the community was too lax in its religious observance, every subsequent drought or illness became confirmation of that belief. If a political leader needed to justify a particular war or policy, a convenient providential reading was never difficult to produce. Providentialism was sincerely believed, but it was also conveniently malleable, and the two things were not in contradiction. It also had the effect of making personal misfortune feel simultaneously more bearable and more oppressive. If everything that happened to you was a divine message, then your suffering had meaning and purpose, which could be comforting. But it also meant that your suffering was in some sense your own fault, the consequence of your spiritual failures, which was considerably less comforting. The emotional life of a devout colonial American must have involved a constant negotiation between the comfort of divine attention and the guilt of divine disappointment. The healing power of disgusting things. If the theological aspects of colonial medicine were psychologically taxing, the practical aspects were physically revolting. The materia medica of colonial American medical practice included a number of substances that a modern person would find extraordinary, not because they were exotic or rare, but because they were deeply, fundamentally disgusting. Urine was considered a useful medical substance. It was used both internally and externally. Drinking one's own urine first thing in the morning was considered by some practitioners to be a general tonic for good health. It was applied topically to wounds and skin conditions. There was a genuine, if entirely incorrect, theoretical basis for this. Urine was thought to carry information about the body's internal state that could be read diagnostically, and its application was thought to rebalance the humors locally. It was not quackery in the sense of being deliberately fraudulent. People genuinely believed it worked, and some of the time it did not make things worse, which is probably enough confirmation for a pre-scientific mindset. Human excrement was another widely used medical substance. Applied to burns, wounds, and a variety of skin conditions, it was considered to have drawing properties that would pull infection from a wound or toxins from a burn. The irony, of course, is that it was quite spectacularly effective at making wounds infected, which would then sometimes clear up on their own through the body's immune response, providing further apparent confirmation that the treatment was working. The corpse was also considered medicinally useful. The fat of executed criminals was particularly prized, partly because executions provided a reliable and regular supply, and partly because the violence of execution was thought to concentrate vital spiritual energies in the body. Moss scraped from the skull of a hanged man was recommended for headaches, and epilepsy, a remedy that crossed the Atlantic from Europe to the colonies and continued to be used well into the 18th century. The logic, such as it was sympathetic. The skull was the seat of the head's problems, and material from another skull might therefore address them. Powdered mummy, imported from Egypt, was a prestige ingredient in 17th century European and colonial medicine. It was expensive, which made it desirable, and it was used as a general strengthening tonic. The active ingredient, such as it was the preserved human flesh of ancient Egyptians, which was ground to powder and either taken internally or applied externally, depending on the condition being treated. The market was lucrative enough that enterprising merchants occasionally substituted fresher and more readily available corpses for genuine mummies. Though this was considered fraud rather than anything more troubling, the underlying principle of using human remains medicinally being perfectly acceptable. Monsters in the New World. The early colonists did not arrive in America with a blank slate regarding what they might find there. They brought with them a rich tradition of beliefs about the creatures that inhabited the edges of the known world, beliefs that had been accumulated over centuries of European travel writing, theology, and folklore. And some of those beliefs were very strange indeed. The idea that remote parts of the world were inhabited by monstrous races, humans who were somehow deformed or different in ways that marked them as products of a different, darker order of creation, was a persistent feature of European thinking well into the early modern period. The headless Blemia, with their faces in their chests, the dog-headed cynocephaly, the one-legged cyapods who used their enormous single foot as an umbrella. These were not fringe beliefs held by the uneducated. They appeared in respected geographical and theological texts, and they shaped the expectations of European explorers and settlers. When the colonists arrived in North America and found it inhabited by people who looked different from themselves, dressed differently, lived differently, and worshipped differently, the temptation to fit them into one of these pre-existing categories of monstrosity was considerable. Early reports from America to Europe contained descriptions of the native peoples that drew on the vocabulary of monstrosity, even when the details were entirely ordinary. The otherness of the indigenous Americans was read through a lens of theological and geographical monstrousness that made genuine understanding almost impossible from the start. Beyond the indigenous peoples, the colonial imagination was also busy populating the interior of the continent with creatures of more straightforwardly fantastical character. There were sea monsters in the coastal waters. There were great beasts in the interior forests. There were creatures that combined features of known animals in ways that natural history had not yet catalogued. Some of these turned out to be real animals that European naturalists had never seen. The opossum, the turkey, the beaver in its full impressive size were all genuinely astonishing to European eyes. Others were more inventive. The expectation of monstrous or supernatural fauna was so strong in the colonial mind that new and genuinely strange things were interpreted through its lens. When the first colonists reported strange lights moving over the marshes at night, they understood them as supernatural phenomena of a threatening character, rather than as the bioluminescent gas that modern science would recognize. When animals behaved unexpectedly or in ways that seemed to defy their natural character, witchcraft was a ready explanation. The natural world of the New World was frightening enough on its own terms. The colonial imagination made it considerably more so. The meaning of dreams and omens in the colonial world, the boundary between the sleeping mind and the waking world, was considerably more permeable than a modern secular person might consider appropriate. Dreams were not the random firing of neurons during sleep. They were messages, warnings, visitations, and communications from both the divine and the diabolical. And a thoughtful Christian had a responsibility to pay attention to them and try to understand what they meant. Dream interpretation had a long biblical lineage, from Joseph in Egypt to the visions of the prophets, that gave it theological respectability. Colonial Americans who dreamed vividly and significantly did not dismiss their dreams as imagination. They wrote them down, discussed them with ministers and family members, and tried to determine whether the communication had come from God or from the devil, whose communications could be distinguished by their content and character if one paid careful attention. Prophetic dreams were reported and believed throughout the colonial period. Dreams that appeared to foretell deaths, illnesses, or catastrophes were taken seriously enough to act on. A person who dreamed of a particular neighbor drowning might warn that neighbor to avoid the water. A dream of fire might prompt extra precautions around the hearth. The fact that such precautions often proved unnecessary, that the feared catastrophe did not occur, was as easily explained within the system as its confirmation would have been. Either the warning had been heeded successfully, or the dream had not been prophetic after all, which was always a possibility one had to allow for. Omens were everywhere and constant. A black cat crossing your path, a bird flying into the house, a mirror breaking, a candle that could not be made to stay lit, an unusual cloud formation, the behavior of animals, the specific circumstances of a birth or death. All of these and dozens more carried potential meaning for the colonial observer. The art of reading omens was not a special skill possessed by particular individuals. It was a general literacy that every reasonably attentive person was expected to possess. What is interesting about colonial omen reading is how unevenly it sat alongside official Puritan theology, which was, in principle, strongly opposed to what it called superstition. The official position was that God communicated through Scripture and through providence, not through the antics of cats or the cracking of mirrors. But the official position and the actual lived beliefs of the population were, then as now, considerably different things. The ministers might preach against superstition on Sunday, but on Monday, the parishioners were still watching the behavior of the first bird they saw in the morning and drawing conclusions about the day ahead. The wonders of alchemy and the philosopher S. Stone alchemy in colonial America occupies an interesting position that is not quite science and not quite magic and not quite religion, but somehow a bit of all three at once. The pursuit of the philosopher's stone, the mysterious substance that would transmute base metals into gold and grant its possessor the secret of eternal life, was a serious intellectual occupation for some of the most educated people in the colonial period, and it was not considered incompatible with Christian faith. For many of its practitioners, alchemy was a form of spiritual investigation, an attempt to read the divine secrets encoded into the physical structure of the created world. John Winthrop, Jr., the son of the first governor of Massachusetts and himself a governor of Connecticut, was a genuine and committed alchemist. He corresponded with European alchemists, maintained a laboratory, and spent years in pursuit of the great work of transmutation. He was also a respected civic leader, a man of genuine intellectual curiosity, and by the standards of his day, an enlightened and moderate figure. His alchemy was not a secret shame. It was simply part of his intellectual life. The theoretical basis of alchemy was not as absurd as it might appear to a modern reader. The idea that all matter was composed of a small number of fundamental substances, and that these substances could be rearranged by sufficiently skillful and knowledgeable manipulation, was a reasonable hypothesis given what 17th century natural philosophy knew about chemistry. The error was not in the basic framework, but in the specific claims about what manipulation could achieve and how. In a sense, alchemy was right about the most fundamental things. Matter is composed of elements. Those elements can be combined and rearranged, and the transformation of one substance into another is a real phenomenon. It was simply wrong about almost every specific detail, including the existence of the philosopher's stone and the feasibility of turning lead into gold. The theological dimension of alchemy deserves emphasis. Many alchemists understood the great work not just as a physical, but as a spiritual achievement. The purification of base matter into gold paralleled the purification of the sinful soul into divine grace. The adept who achieved the transmutation would not merely have produced a valuable metal. He would have understood something about the structure of God's creation that brought him closer to the divine mind. In this sense, alchemy was a form of prayer conducted in a laboratory, and the failure to achieve the great work was as much a spiritual as a practical failure. This combination of spiritual ambition and practical investigation, earnestly pursued, characterizes a great deal of early colonial intellectual life. Bloodletting, astrology, and the physician as almanaque, colonial American physician who treated patients without consulting an almanac would have been considered negligent by his peers. The almanac, that humble annual publication that is now associated mainly with weather forecasts and jokes, was in the colonial period a sophisticated technical document that told the physician when it was and was not advisable to perform various medical procedures based on the position of the stars and planets. The astrological basis of colonial medicine was inherited directly from medieval Europe and was considered entirely compatible with Christian theology. The heavenly bodies, after all, were God's creation, and the idea that he had arranged them to have effects on earthly life was simply an extension of the providential worldview. God spoke through the movements of the stars as he spoke through all of the natural world. The physician who ignored the stars was therefore ignoring a source of divine communication, which was both foolish and impious. The relationship between the zodiac and the human body was worked out in considerable detail. Each sign of the zodiac was associated with a specific part of the body. Aries ruled the head, Taurus the neck and throat, Gemini the arms and shoulders, and so on through to Pisces, which ruled the feet. Medical procedures involving those body parts were considered more dangerous or more effective, depending on where the moon currently sat in relation to the relevant sign. Bloodletting, that universal remedy. Imagine stepping back in time, not just 100 years, but 300 or 400 to colonial America. The world looks different, sure, but what's truly mind-boggling is how people thought about the world. Their reality was filled with invisible forces, terrifying beasts, and practical magic that were as real to them as gravity is to us. Today, we're diving deep into the strange and fascinating beliefs that shaped their daily lives, from medicine guided by the stars to the very real fear of sea monsters. Let's start with a trip to the doctor. In the 17th and 18th centuries, your physician would likely consult an almanac before even thinking about treatment. Why? Astrology wasn't a quirky hobby. It was a cornerstone of medicine. Every part of the body was ruled by a zodiac sign. For instance, you absolutely did not want to be bled from the arm if the moon was in Gemini, which governed the arms and shoulders. That was just common sense. Even Benjamin Franklin, famous for his scientific mind, got his start publishing Poor Richard's Almanac *. While he later added a satirical twist, he was tapping into a tradition where these books were serious medical tools. It might sound silly to us, but this was a complete, detailed, and internally consistent system. It was supported by the top intellectuals of the age. People weren't being foolish. They were using the most advanced knowledge available to them in a perfectly rational way. The knowledge just happened to be completely wrong. Now let's leave the doctor's office and head to the docks. The vast Atlantic Ocean wasn't just a body of water separating the colonies from Europe. It was a terrifying, mysterious realm, home to monsters of incredible size and power. And the most common culprit? The sea serpent. Reports of enormous snake-like creatures were constant, especially off the coast of New England. And these weren't just tall tales from excitable sailors. The reports came from respected ship captains, fishermen, merchants, and even ministers. Newspapers wrote about them, educated people corresponded about them. The famous Gloucester sea serpent of the early 19th century was just the latest in a long line of sightings that started when the first European ships arrived. This belief wasn't just folklore. It was backed by theology and science of the time. The Bible mentioned great sea creatures like Leviathan, so the existence of sea monsters fit perfectly with Scripture. Natural historians included them in their catalogs of real animals without a hint of irony. They appeared on maps or described in bestiaries. Their existence was considered a simple fact. Think about the sheer terror of an Atlantic crossing. It was incredibly dangerous. Ships sank with horrifying regularity. In a way, Believing in sea monsters might have been psychologically helpful. It gave a name and a face to the nameless dread of the ocean. You could pray to be protected from a sea monster. It was much harder to get a theological grip on the random, destructive power of a storm. Of course, over time, as the Enlightenment dawned, these creatures started to fade from respectable science. But they didn't go quietly. Each new report sparked serious debate. The idea that giant, unknown creatures might still be lurking in the ocean's depths wasn't dismissed overnight. And in a way, they were right. The discovery of the giant squid and other deep-sea behemoths proved that the intuition that the ocean held large, unknown things wasn't so ridiculous after all. Finally, let's walk through a colonial town. Alongside the strict Puritan church, there was another, more mysterious world thriving just beneath the surface, the world of practical magic. This wasn't the devil worship of the Salem Witch Trials. This was the everyday work of what historians call cunning folk. These were men and women with specialized knowledge of charms, rituals, and remedies. Need to find a lost cow? Identify a thief? Cure a strange illness? Or protect your home from evil? You'd go see the local cunning person. Now, this put them in a tricky spot. Officially, Puritan theology condemned all magic. Ministers preached against it constantly. But it seems their congregations weren't always listening. People from all walks of life, even the most devout churchgoers, would consult a cunning person without feeling any contradiction. It was just a practical part of life. Their methods were surprisingly specific. One popular technique for finding a thief was called sieve and scissors divination. A sieve was balanced on a pair of shears, and it would supposedly turn to point out the guilty party. Another method involved balancing a key on a specific Bible verse and watching its movement. If you believed a witch had made you sick, you might create a witch bottle. This was a sealed container of your own urine, which was then heated. The idea was that this would cause the witch to either reveal themselves or suffer in sympathy. And we know people did this. These bottles have been found. Speaking of physical evidence, this is where it gets truly fascinating. When old colonial homes in New England are renovated, workers often find objects deliberately hidden inside the walls. Things like old shoes, bottles, mummified cats, and strange carved marks. These weren't forgotten junk. They were protective charms, known as apotropaic magic, placed there during construction to ward off evil spirits and protect the family inside. The people who did this weren't outliers practicing forbidden arts. They were ordinary people, taking what they saw as ordinary precautions. For them, concealing a shoe in a wall was a form of practical housekeeping, as normal as locking the doors at night. From the stars guiding a surgeon's hand, to serpents in the sea, to a shoe hidden in the wall for protection, the colonial world was governed by a set of rules that are almost alien to us now. It is a powerful reminder that rational is always based on what is known at the time. Their world was filled with wonders and terrors we can barely imagine, woven into the very fabric of their reality. Thanks so much for joining me on this journey back in time. If you found this as fascinating as I do, make sure to like this video and subscribe for more deep dives into the hidden corners of history. See you next time. Comets, earthquakes, and the end of the world. The colonial period was punctuated by natural events that the settlers interpreted through their theological framework with particular intensity. Comets and earthquakes were perhaps the most powerful of these, not because they were more common than other natural events, but because they were both dramatic and, in the theological understanding of the time, directly and unambiguously communicative. A comet in the colonial sky was not an astronomical phenomenon with a predictable orbital period. It was a warning. The word comet itself derives from the Greek for long-haired star, and the shaggy, irregular appearance of a comet in the night sky seemed designed by Providence to attract attention. The question was always, what is being communicated, and to whom? The appearance of a comet, coinciding with the death of a monarch, confirmed that the comet had been a death omen. The appearance of a comet before a war confirmed it as a war omen. The apparent correspondence between comets and subsequent catastrophes was genuine in the sense that catastrophes are fairly regular, and a sufficiently motivated observer could always find one to correspond to any given comet. Increase. Mather published a treatise on comets in 1683, in which he took them entirely seriously as divine communications, while also trying to understand them in terms of natural philosophy. This combination of theological and natural inquiry was characteristic of the best colonial intellectual work. The comets were real astronomical objects, Mather acknowledged. They had physical causes, and they were also divine communications, because God worked through physical causes as well as through miracles. The challenge was to understand both dimensions simultaneously. Earthquakes prompted similar responses. The Great New England earthquake of 1755, centered near Cape Ann in Massachusetts, was powerful enough to be felt throughout the colonial settlements and prompted an outpouring of theological interpretation. Jonathan Edwards, the most intellectually formidable of the colonial ministers, had by then become one of the leading figures of the Great Awakening, and the earthquake provided powerful confirmation of his message about the reality of divine judgment. God was capable of shaking the earth. The earth had been shaken. The inhabitants of the earth should consider why. The anxiety about the end of the world that runs through so much colonial theological writing deserves mention here. The colonists were not merely concerned about individual death, though they were certainly concerned about that. They were also concerned about eschatology, the final end of everything, and they lived with an expectation of its imminence that is difficult for most modern people to fully imaginatively inhabit. The world was going to end. Scripture said so. The signs were all around them. The question was not whether, but when. And the answer might be very soon indeed. This eschatological urgency shaped the moral and social life of the colonies in ways both productive and destructive, driving both genuine spiritual revival and episodes of collective hysteria that ended badly for everyone involved. Afterward, what the colonists got right, it is tempting, after cataloging the bizarre beliefs of America's early colonists, to congratulate ourselves on how far we have come. The humoral medicine is gone, replaced by something that actually works. The witch trials are over, replaced by a justice system that is imperfect, but at least theoretically committed to evidence. The sea monsters have been reclassified. The comets have been given orbital periods rather than omen interpretations. We know more about how the world works than any previous generation of human beings, and we should be grateful for that. But the colonial beliefs were not simply errors to be corrected. They were the products of human minds trying to make sense of genuinely difficult circumstances with the tools available. The colonists were afraid, reasonably so, of a world that was genuinely dangerous. They were isolated, many of them, in a way that modern urbanized people can barely imagine. They were dependent on agricultural cycles they could not fully control, vulnerable to diseases they did not understand, at war with people they could not communicate with, and subject to the random violence of a climate that could destroy a year's work in an afternoon. Under these circumstances, the systems of meaning they constructed, however strange to modern eyes, served real psychological and social functions. The providential worldview gave catastrophe meaning. The witch accusation gave the community a mechanism for dealing with inexplicable misfortune and social tension. The magical practices of the cunning folk gave individuals a sense of agency in a world that often felt entirely beyond their control. The astrological medicine, however ineffective, gave the physician a structured way to approach the problem of treatment that was better than nothing at all. The belief in monsters populated the unknown with intelligible, if terrifying, beings rather than leaving it as a void. We should be careful about what we learn from the colonial belief system. The lesson is not that religion is always dangerous, or that pre-scientific thinking is simply ignorance to be swept away. The lesson is more subtle and more unsettling. It is that human beings, even intelligent and sincere and well-intentioned ones, construct systems of belief in response to their circumstances, and that those systems can be both psychologically useful and practically catastrophic, sometimes simultaneously. The Puritan minister who believed in witchcraft was not stupid. He was a human being, doing what human beings do. The question we might ask of ourselves in our own age of new anxieties and new uncertainties is which of our own sincerely held beliefs will look to people who come after us as strange as spectral evidence and sympathetic magic look to us now. The answer might be uncomfortable, but the willingness to ask it is perhaps the most important lesson the colonists have to teach us, not about their world, but about our own.